My sister was reborn, but her brain wasn't. She's still an idiot. In our last life, she had an epic, all-consuming romance with the golden boy of the Ashford dynasty. Skipping class, street racing, wild fights. She did it all and ultimately died for him in a downpour. And somehow he pinned the blame for all of it on me. After her rebirth, she convinced our parents to transfer me into his class. This time, it's your turn to be bullied by him and star in your own tragic love story. Big sister. I smiled. An idiot is always an idiot. She could live 100 more lives and still wouldn't be worthy of being my opponent. In my last life, I was beaten to death by my adoptive parents under the guise of a family dinner. Right before I died, their twisted faces hovered over me. We only raised you for Stella's sake. Now that she's gone, what value could your life possibly have? A baseball bat smashed into my skull. The blood pouring down dyed my vision crimson. I woke abruptly in darkness. The scene before me was startlingly clear, making me freeze for 2 seconds. Bright sunlight filled a familiar room. Sitting in front of me were my adoptive mother and my sister. Then I heard my adoptive mother's urgent voice. Stella, what in the world is going on? Your teacher called, saying you've applied to transfer into that remedial class. Dead last class in your grade. Across from me, my sister, Stella Calloway, lifted her head with a slightly dazed look. Transfer classes? She blinked as if something had just clicked, let her gaze travel around the room, and then raised a finger to point at me. Mom, the teacher got it mixed up. I meant we should transfer my sister. Class 13 is full of struggling students. She's always so eager to help others. I bet she'd be thrilled to go help them out. In our last life, Stella fell madly in love at first sight with Julian Harrington, the heir of the Harrington Empire. Barely 2 months into the school year, she was crying and begging to transfer into his class. Class 13, the notorious dead last remedial class in the entire grade. Our adoptive mother had always spoiled her rotten. So after barely any hesitation, she agreed. What followed was 7 years of Stella's messy, obsessive entanglement with Julian. In the end, she got into a drunken street race for him and died in the middle of a storm. In my past life, I had almost no interaction with Julian Harrington. We exchanged a few words at a couple of reunions after graduation. Nothing more. Yet, Stella had always seen me as the thorn in her side. She'd stubbornly convinced herself that the reason Julian kept breaking up and getting back together with her was because I was the unattainable fantasy living in his heart. Now watching the barely disguised malice and hatred in her eyes, as she looked at me, I understood in an instant Stella Calloway had been reborn too. Hearing her suggestion, our adoptive mother turned to me. Stella's right. I'll go to the school today and take care of the transfer paperwork for you. Her tone made it clear there was no room for argument. I knew the truth. On paper, the Calloways had taken me, and out of gratitude for my father's sacrifice. He was a distant relative who died saving their lives. But from beginning to end, they only saw me as a servant designated for Stella's convenience. They never truly treated me like a daughter in the previous life. When Stella was crying to transfer, our adoptive mother worried, had initially planned to send me along with her. But Stella threw a fit and refused. So the idea was dropped. Afterward, Stella had started up to me gloating. Don't think I don't know. Julian skipped class to watch your violin competition. Did you really think I'd give you a chance to be around him? Every single day. I had looked at her stupid self-satisfied face and said nothing. Julian Harrington coming to watch my violin competition? What a joke. The guy probably didn't even know how many strings a violin had. I was the one who had planted that rumor, through a convoluted chain of gossip. For one reason only, to stop Stella from dragging me down with her. But now that she'd been reborn, I wasn't opposed to playing a different game with her. That night, Stella slipped silently into my room. In that house, my door wasn't allowed to have a lock, 'cause I wasn't permitted any privacy. She stood beside my bed, her cold, venomous gaze crawling over me inch by inch. Finally, she broke into a smile. Big sister, this time it's your turn to be bullied by him. Your turn for the tragic, epic love story. Maybe she'd tip someone off beforehand. The next day, the moment I stepped through the door of class 13 with my backpack, book came flying straight at my face. I tilted my head slightly and dodged it. A second later, a lazy voice drawled from the front of the room. Who gave you permission to duck? Julian Harrington was slouched back in his chair, legs propped up on the desk. He stared at me with complete arrogance. Fine, I'll give you a chance. Pick up the book. Walk it up to me with proper respect, and let me throw it again. Do that and I'll leave you alone. This morning hearing this, my eyes flickered. I bent down, picked the book up off the floor, and walked toward him. Step by step. Julian had a few of his boys standing around him, all looking at me with open contempt and undisguised cruelty. I smiled. You mean throw it like this? With those words, I slammed the book's hard spine directly into the bridge of his nose. with every ounce of force I had. Ack! Julian shot up from his chair, hands flying to his nose as blood gushed between his fingers. He stared at me and a vicious grin split his face. You're dead, you bitch. You're finished. You have no idea what you've just done. His crew's faces darkened and they started closing in. Just in time. The teacher walked into the classroom. Everyone, this is our new transfer student, advanced. She placed second on the entrance exam. I hope you'll all get along and follow her example. Top student, huh? Julian sneered. Don't worry, Teach. We'll definitely get along real peacefully with our new classmate. His bullying tactics were no different. From every cliché you've ever read. Thumbtacks on my chair, dead snakes and dead rats in my drawer. I pulled out the tacks without flinching. I picked up the dead animals with a blank expression and tossed them right back into Julian's lap, with which made him shriek and turn green. When he realized those tricks weren't working, he moved on to simple direct violence. One afternoon after school, I opened my math workbook and found a small slip of paper tucked inside. They're going to take you to the equipment shed. I stared down at the note for a few seconds, then crumpled it and tossed it in the trash. Who had written it? In my last life, I'd heard that Class 13 was just a dumping ground for hopeless underachievers. But after I transferred in this time and started observing, I realized that wasn't true at all. The class was divided into two factions. On one side was Julian and his little gang of thugs, throwing their weight around. The rest were mostly ordinary students. Poor kids, kids with difficult home situations, kids just struggling to survive. The space they had to breathe and learn was crushed down to almost nothing by the Crown Prince and his minions. My eyes swept across the few students still scattered around the room. They landed on a girl named Sophie Chin, who sat diagonally behind Julian. She looked away hastily, refusing to meet my eyes. I understood. Pretending I hadn't figured it out, I picked up my bag and stood up. Hey, Alara. She looked like she'd been wrestling with herself forever, before she finally called out, let us walk with you after school. She and a few other girls beside her looked at me with courage, gathered from somewhere deep. I was silent for a moment, taking in their timid yet brave faces. Then I let my lips curve into a smile. It's fine. Don't get yourselves caught up in this. I had barely stepped out of the classroom when Julian and his crew shoved and jostled me into the equipment shed. At the far corner of the sports field, there I saw an infuriatingly familiar face. Stella was standing right beside Julian. He jutted his chin at me. So this is the sister you told me about. The one who's been lording it over your family, because her dad did you some favor. Yeah. Stella's reply was flat. But you shouldn't bully her like this. I don't want to become like you. She put on a perfect performance of wounded dignity, of tragic, aloof strength. It was the complete opposite of the Stella from my last life, one who'd sobbed and begged Julian not to break up with her. A second shot at life. And she'd finally figured out that this degenerate piece of work only craved what wouldn't give him the time of day. Sure enough, seeing her act this way made Julian's expression soften with something like pity. Stella took a deep breath, feigning a tone of reluctant pleading. And besides, my sister has studied violin for years. Her hands are the most precious thing she has. Julian barked out a laugh. The more precious something is, the prettier it looks when it's destroyed. Don't you think? I waved at the two guys holding me today. Right here. Break her fingers one by one. I want to make sure she never picks up a violin again. For the rest of her life. At those words, Stella turned her eyes on me, and the sheer, ecstatic glee in them was almost impossible for her to conceal. They forced me roughly against the uneven bars. Someone picked up a heavy dumbbell from the floor, hefting it for the swing that was about to come. I spoke up, idiots. What did you say? Enter code in Macaron app to get full text. Free tutorial and pin video. Idiots. The word hung in the dusty, chalk-scented air of the equipment shed. The goon holding the dumbbell hesitated, his meathead brain struggling to process why the prey wasn't begging. Julian frowned, his bruised nose crinkling. What did you say? I said you're idiots, I repeated, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. You brought me to the one place on campus with no security cameras, a single exit, and a floor littered with heavy, blunt objects. Before the guy holding my left arm could tighten his grip, I dropped my weight entirely, twisting my body torque against his thumb joint. He yelped his grip, snapping open. In the same fraction of a second, my right foot lashed out, driving the steel toe of my boot directly into the kneecap of the guy with the dumbbell. There was a sickening pop. He screamed, dropping the iron weight. It crashed onto his own foot, shattering his instep. I didn't stop. Momentum was a weapon, and I was already moving. I grabbed a rusted, solid steel javelin tip from a broken rack beside me and lunged at Julian. He barely had time to widen his eyes before I slammed him against the cinder block wall, my forearm crushing his windpipe, the jagged steel tip pressed a millimeter from his carotid artery. The remaining goons froze. Stella gasped, stumbling backward until her shoulders hit the metal door. Tell them to back off, I whispered, leaning into Julian. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the sudden, sharp scent of his fear. I pressed the steel in just enough to draw a single drop of blood. Or the Harrington Empire gets handed to your cousin. Be back off. Julian choked out, his hands hovering helplessly in the air. Everyone back the hell off. The goons retreated, dragging their groaning friend. I kept my eyes locked on Julian's. Listen to me very carefully, you spoiled little sociopath, I said softly, ensuring only he and Stella could hear. I don't care about your money, your status, or whatever pathetic complex makes you terrorize teenagers. But if you or your dogs ever look in my direction again, I won't go for your hands. I'll take your eyes. Not if you understand. He swallowed hard, wincing as the movement dragged his throat against the steel. He nodded. I let him go, stepping back smoothly. Julian crumpled to his knees, coughing violently. I turned to look at Stella. Her face was ashen, the carefully constructed mask of aloof tragedy, completely shattered. Her eyes were wide, darting between me and the bleeding golden boy on the floor. Not quite the epic romance you envisioned, is it, big sister? I murmured, tossing the javelin tip onto the floor. It clattered loudly. I adjusted my backpack, smoothed my uniform, and walked out into the afternoon sun. By Monday, the hierarchy of Class 13 had shifted. It wasn't a loud revolution. It was a quiet, suffocating freeze. When I walked into the classroom, Julian's desk was empty. He was out on medical leave. His lackeys avoided my gaze, shrinking into their seats. I walked to my desk, took out my books, and looked over at Sophie Chen. She was staring at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. I slid a folded piece of paper across the aisle onto her desk. It was the math homework, perfectly solved. Copy it, I said without looking at her. Then help the others. Sophie blinked, then slowly reached for the paper. Why are you doing this? She whispered. Because a classroom is for learning, I replied, opening my textbook. Not for dogs to mark their territory. Over the next month, Class 13 transformed. Without Julian's constant violence, the suffocating atmosphere lifted. I started running unauthorized study sessions. During lunch, the hopeless underachievers weren't stupid, they were traumatized and exhausted. Once they realized I was a shield Julian's gang couldn't break, they began to try. Grades crept up. Spines straightened. Stella, meanwhile, was spiraling. Her grand plan of playing the untouchable goddess had failed spectacularly, because the god she was trying to attract had been thoroughly humiliated. When Julian finally returned to school, he was different. The arrogant swagger was replaced by a paranoid edge. He avoided me like the plague, which meant he also avoided Class 13 as much as possible. Stella tried to corner him in the hallways, putting on her act. I watched from a distance one afternoon as she stood by his locker, offering him a perfectly curated look of cold indifference mixed with hidden longing. I heard about what happened, Stella said, her voice carrying down the hall. My sister is unhinged. I told you to stay away from her. Julian slammed his locker shut, flinching at the loud noise. He looked at Stella, not with desire, but with a sudden vicious resentment. You set me up. What? Stella's mask slipped. You told me she was weak. A target. Julian stepped closer, his face twisting into something ugly. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. You wanted me to do your dirty work, didn't you, Calloway? You're just a leech. He shoved her aside and walked away. Stella stood frozen, her eyes welling with tears. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. In her last life, her reckless devotion had won him over. In this life, her calculated distance had only made her a target for his displaced rage. She looked up and saw me watching. The hatred that flashed across her face was venomous. The family dinner happened 2 weeks later. In my past life, this was the night I died. The night they battered my skull in. Because Stella had perished in a car crash, and they needed a scapegoat to unleash their grief upon. This time, Stella was very much alive, sitting across from me, picking at her roasted duck. But the atmosphere was just as toxic. The Calloways were running out of money. My adoptive father's logistics company had been hemorrhaging contracts for months, largely due to a series of anonymous tips sent to the IRS and his major clients about his creative accounting practices. Tips I had meticulously compiled and encrypted over the past 2 months. Alara, my adoptive father barked, slamming his wine glass down. Your teacher called. You've been leading some sort of gang in Class 13, intimidating the Harrington boy. I tutor math, Richard, I said, not looking up from my plate. If Julian Harrington is intimidated by calculus. That sounds like a Harrington problem. My adoptive mother slammed her hand on the table. Don't get smart with us. Do you know what you've done? Julian's father just pulled his investment from our firm. Because of you. Because of me? I finally looked up, wiping my mouth with a napkin. Or because the firm is a hollow shell built on embezzled funds? The dining room went dead silent. Richard's face drained of color. What did you just say? He whispered. I said I know about the life insurance payout, I replied smoothly, leaning back in my chair. My biological father didn't die saving your lives. He died because you, Richard, fell asleep at the wheel and crashed into a divider. My father pulled you both out before the car caught fire, but a drunk driver hit him on the shoulder. He died. And you took the $2 million insurance policy meant for me, forged guardianship documents, and used it to start your company. Stella gasped, looking at her parents. Mom, is that true? Shut up, Stella. Richard roared, standing up. He looked exactly as he had in my last life right before he swung the baseball bat. His eyes were bloodshot. His face contorted in murderous panic. You ungrateful little bitch. We put a roof over your head. We fed you. He lunged across the table. But I wasn't the broken, beaten girl from my past life. And I certainly wasn't. Unarmed. As he reached for my throat, I picked up the heavy crystal water pitcher and smashed it directly into his face. He howled, falling backward into the china cabinet, glass shattering everywhere. My adoptive mother screamed, rushing toward him. Stella said paralyzed. Herr Folk. Still halfway to her mouth. I stood up, brushing a stray piece of crystal off my sleeve. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen displaying an active recording timer. It had been running since I sat down. The police are already on their way, I said quietly, the sound of distant sirens beginning to bleed through the evening air. I sent them the original insurance documents along with the proof of your tax evasion an hour ago. The assault just now? That's just the cherry on top. You ruined us, my adoptive mother shrieked, clutching Richard's bleeding face. We are your family. You're a parasite, I corrected coldly. I looked at Stella, who was trembling violently. And you, sister, enjoy poverty. I hear it builds character. The fallout was absolute. Richard Calloway was arrested for fraud, embezzlement, and assault. The company's assets were frozen, and the house was seized by the bank. As a minor victim of financial fraud and abuse, I was granted immediate emancipation and full access to a state-managed restitution fund reclaimed from the Calloway accounts. Stella and her mother were forced to move into a cramped, one-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of the city. Without her wealth, her designer clothes, and her pristine reputation, Stella's carefully constructed facade crumbled. She returned to school a week later, looking like a ghost. Her uniform was wrinkled, her hair unkempt. The elite students of Ashford, who smelled blood in the water like sharks, immediately ostracized her. Desperate, Stella turned to the only lifeline she thought she had left, Julian. She abandoned her aloof persona entirely. She reverted to the girl from our past life, needy, desperate, obsessive. She waited for him by his car, followed him between classes, and begged him to help her family. But Julian Harrington was not a savior. He was a predator who only liked toys that were shiny and unbroken. Get off me, you freak. I heard him snarl one afternoon in the courtyard. Stella was clutching the sleeve of his jacket, tears streaming down her face. Julian, please, you know me. You loved me. Stella sobbed, the lines of her past life bleeding dangerously into her current reality. She was losing her grip on which life she was actually living. We belong together. I would die for you. I don't even know you, psycho. Julian pushed her hard. Stella tripped over the curb and scraped her knees on the asphalt. The courtyard erupted in cruel laughter. Julian sneered down at her. You're pathetic. If you come near me again, I'll have security drag you out. I stood by the courtyard pillars, watching the scene unfold. Sophie came up beside me, handing me a carton of iced tea. It's kind of sad, isn't it? Sophie murmured, looking at Stella sobbing on the ground. No, I took a sip of the tea. It's just the consequences of her own choices. She wanted an epic romance with a monster. Monsters bite. But Julian's reign was coming to an end too. While Stella had been busy chasing a toxic boy, I had been busy dismantling his father's empire. The Harringtons were deeply involved in illegal land seizures for their real estate developments. With the hacking skills I had honed purely out of survival instinct in my past life, I had breached their corporate servers. I didn't just leak the documents. I sent them to their biggest corporate rival, the district attorney, and 5 major news outlets simultaneously. 3 days before the end of the semester, federal agents raided the Harrington Empire headquarters. Julian was pulled out of class by the principal, his face pale, his arrogant swagger entirely gone. He walked past me in the hallway, looking like a dead man walking. Careful on the stairs, Julian, I said softly as he passed. It's a long way down. The climax of Stella's delusion arrived on the night of the winter formal. It was raining. A torrential, biblical downpour that flooded the streets and turned the sky pitch black. It was the exact same weather as the night Stella had died in our past life. I didn't go to the dance. I was in the school's music room, practicing my violin. The restitution money had allowed me to buy a beautiful, antique instrument. The sound of the strings echoed through the empty halls, a melancholic, triumphant melody. I was leaving Ashford tomorrow. I had been accepted into a prestigious music conservatory in Vienna on a full scholarship. The door to the music room banged open. I stopped playing, lowering my bow. Stella stood in the doorway, soaked to the bone. Her makeup was running down her face in dark, muddy streaks. Her eyes were wild, dilated, and completely unhinged. She held a heavy metal wrench in her hand, the same kind I had used to threaten Julian months ago. You, she breathed, her voice raspy and broken. You took it all. You took my life. You ruined your own life, Stella, I said calmly, carefully placing my violin in its velvet-lined case. I just refused to be your collateral damage this time. He was mine, she screamed, stepping into the room. Julian was mine. We were supposed to be together. You made him hate me. You made my parents lose everything. Your parents were criminals and Julian is a sociopath, I replied, snapping. The case shut. You were reborn, Stella, and you chose to chase the exact same garbage that killed you the first time. You aren't a victim. You're just a fool. With a primal scream, she lunged at me, swinging the wrench toward my head. I didn't even flinch. I stepped smoothly off the dais, sweeping my leg out. Stella, blinded by rain and rage, tripped over my foot. Her momentum carried her forward, and she slammed face first into the heavy oak podium. The wrench clattered uselessly across the floor. She collapsed, groaning, holding her bleeding nose. Get up, I said coldly. She didn't. She just lay there, sobbing pathetically into the cold floorboards. In my last life, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room, I died looking at the twisted faces of the people who were supposed to protect me. I felt my skull crack. I choked on my own blood. And you know what the worst part was? The worst part was knowing I died for absolutely nothing. I died so you could be a tragic memory for a boy who didn't even care. I walked over and picked up the wrench, weighing it in my hand. Stella scrambled backward like a crab, whimpering in terror. Please. Alara, please, I'm your sister. You were never my sister. I raised the wrench. Stella squeezed her eyes shut and shrieked. I let it drop. It clanged loudly against the floor, inches from her hand. I'm not like you, I said softly. I don't need to destroy you, Stella. You're already nothing. I picked up my violin case, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and walked to the door. I paused and looked back at her one last time. She was curled in a fetal position, a broken, empty shell of a girl who had wasted 2 entire lifetimes. Goodbye, Stella. I walked out into the hallway, the sound of her sobbing fading behind me. 10 years later, the concert hall in Vienna was packed. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the audience. I stood center stage, the applause washing over me like a physical wave. I took a deep bow, smiling as the conductor shook my hand. My debut as the lead soloist for the Philharmonic was a triumph. Later, in my dressing room, I poured a glass of champagne and pulled out my phone. I had kept a quiet tab on the ghosts of my past, not out of obsession, but out of a clinical curiosity. Julian Harrington was currently serving a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. Without his father's money to protect him, his violent tendencies had escalated. He had severely beaten a man in a bar fight over a spilled drink, and had been tried as a habitual offender. Richard and my adoptive mother were still drowning in debt, living in a trailer park in Nevada. And Stella. A local news article from my hometown popped up on the screen. It was a mugshot. Stella Calloway, age 27, arrested for a DUI and attempting to outrun the police in a stolen car. The article noted it had been raining heavily at the time of the arrest. In the photo, her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow and vacant. The epic romance heroine had faded into a miserable, forgotten statistic. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the vanity. I picked up my violin, gently plucking the E-string. The note rang out clear, bright, and perfectly in tune. An idiot is always an idiot, no matter how many lives they are given. But a survivor? A survivor takes the broken pieces and builds an empire of her own. I raised my glass to the mirror, meeting my own calm, steady gaze. To the first life, I whispered. I took a sip of the champagne. It tasted like absolute victory.